Hey, it's Justin Potney on the Mixed Morning Grind as we celebrate Fort Saskatchewan on the Heartland Tour, our final Heartland Tour stop of the summer. Kyle Bjornson joins me now, the curator for the Fort Heritage Precinct. Kyle, how are you?
Good. How are you, Justin?
I'm doing fantastic. How's your summer been?
It's been pretty good. A little
Nice to,
quiet.
yeah, nice to get a little bit of rain recently after all that dry conditions we've had, eh?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's great.
So, Kyle, let's talk a little bit about the history of Fort Saskatchewan. Nobody knows it better than you. It is your daily job inside and out. And, well, I kind of want to know a little bit more about the beginnings of our community.
Sure. So the settlement of Fort Saskatchewan really begins with the Northwest Mounted Police. So they come out west on what's called the March West in the summer of 1874. They leave from Manitoba, and they split off around a place called Roche Percé in Saskatchewan around sometime in, I believe, July of 1874. They weren't finding a lot of potable water along the way, and so animals were getting sick. Some of the men were sick. So Inspector William Dummer Jarvis volunteered to lead about 20 men and some of the sicker animals and separate and go up to Fort Edmonton rather than continue on with the rest of the force to Fort Whippup around Lethbridge to kind of put an end to the whiskey trading down there. So they made that trek up to Fort Edmonton. They made it by the end of November 1874, and they wintered over there. But they decided to, in the spring, come to Fort Saskatchewan. So there's some kind of stories about how some of the people in Edmonton and Richard Hardesty, who was the fort factor, being a little too forceful with Jarvis of wanting him to build the fort across the river from where the university is now. And Jarvis apparently didn't really like being told what to do, so he decided that he was going to head downstream to where we are now. But apparently there were actually already plans by Superintendent McLeod and Jarvis to set up here because the slopes of the riverbanks are a little gentler here. And so they thought that the railway was actually going to come here. And the original plan for the Canadian Pacific Railway was actually to come up through roughly where Fort Saskatchewan is now, and then down to the Yellowhead Pass. But then that changed, and they decided to take a more direct southern route and go through Fort Calgary. And then that way. So that's really how we end up here, is in the spring of 1875. They built the fort here. There's already the farming community in Lamoro or Lanaroo, whatever your preference is. It seems to people pronounce it either way. So there were already the Lamaro brothers over on the other side of the farming. So it was the farming community. There were also indigenous people in this area as well. It's a little further north, better access to people kind of settling up further. So that's where the settlement really begins, is when those 20 people plus their Métis Teamsters as well come here, and they build the fort in the spring of 1875. And then settlement starts to build around that, and people kind of come in, set up farmsteads, and the town develops. They really mark up what is our downtown by the 1890s. But it's kind of a growing community even by the 1880s. And then by about the time the railway arrives in 1905, there's about 500 people living here.
So is that one of those things? Because it seems like, talking about some of the other communities throughout the West, whenever a railway would come through, you really saw expansion then.
Yeah. So it did. The expansion really kind of starts in the years leading up to the arrival of the the Canadian Northern Railway line. Then it doubles after that in the next kind of 5 years, and then kind of plateaus at about 1,000 until the arrival of Sherritt Gordon and the industry in the 1950s. And we don't see it really double until then. And then we end up with about 2,000 and sometime in the 1950s, then up to about 3,000 to 4,000 in the early 60s, and then kind of continues to grow from there. But it kind of stayed a little stagnant at around 1,000 people from about 1910 or so up until the 1950s.
So is it fair to say that industry was a big driver in population growth in the later years, as you were just talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that really is where the uptick comes in, is when we do have that the industrial when the industry kind of comes in here with Dow and Sherritt Gordon initially. Before that, and initially in the early years, they really thought that the town boosters, like the Fort Saskatchewan Board of Trade, thought that Fort Saskatchewan was going to become an industrial hub itself. They thought that the Canadian Northern Railway was going to build or make Fort Saskatchewan a divisional point, which means that their roundhouses would have been here and their shops. So it would have given jobs to about 300 or so artisans. And they thought this was going to be a distribution center. And so they had some big plans. There was a hydroelectric dam that was built in 1910 up in the Sturgeon Creek River, but it failed within about a year. And they had big plans for some cold storage, a tile works, a lot of things that they were trying to attract people to come here with some of the amenities that were already in place. There was a nice little kind of downtown business district that had developed in the early 1900s. There was great farmland. Fort Saskatchewan had the first brick school that was built in, it started building in 1903. It was finished in 1904, but it was the first one between Winnipeg and Edmonton.
So we've seen, we've talked to lots of folks that, we're talking about the future of Fort Saskatchewan because it is so bright and there's so many opportunities. But, it does pay to look back and to see our history. And it must be a kind of a cool job for you. You have a very unique job, Kyle, to be able to look back into history every single day and kind of do a little bit of detective work, I would imagine, in figuring some of this stuff out, right?
Yeah, it's great. It's the favorite part of my job is learning about these little details about the community. My training is really, I'm a Civil War historian, U.S. Civil War historian. But I find myself more interested in kind of social history and learning about those aspects of the community, particularly the early years, how it kind of developed and how people kind of interacted with each other and those kind of things, and kind of digging into those details and finding that out.
So most of the long-term residents of the area, or long-term residents of Fort Saskatchewan, know a good amount about the Fort Heritage Precinct grounds. And those who maybe don't or are new to the community, because there's plenty of them, what can you give us as far as background on the Fort Heritage Precinct and maybe what it's like today for people to come and check out?
So the Fort Heritage Precinct, it was formerly known as the Fort Saskatchewan Museum and Historic Site. It was started by the Fort Saskatchewan Historical Society. In the late 1960s and 1970, they were given a piece of land on the corner of the jail property, which included the courthouse. And they built this machine shed and open shed to kind of show off farm equipment and some things like that. And they started bringing over some older houses from what is known in the Fort Saskatchewan district. So some stuff that is now Strathcona County, like areas around Josephburg and things like that. So we have the Castle School. We also have the Bolton School, and those are over from that area, kind of a little more northeast of here, that kind of tell that story, early education, and we use some of it for our program space. We also have the Soda Lake Church to give a little bit of that early kind of religious history. That's from closer to Beggarville. But we also have the Dr. Henry House, which used to be on 103rd Street and 99th, right on the corner. Dr. Henry was the most prominent doctor in town between 1918 and I believe he stopped practicing in the 1950s. He passed away in 1963. And so you can see his house, how he would have lived, probably in the 1920s, 1930s, that era. We also have a blacksmith shop. That's purpose built, but you can get kind of an idea of the work that would have been done in a blacksmith shop. And you see some farm equipment. They have the courthouse, which we do some temporary exhibits in as well. It changes up. That was built in 1909, so that was an important part of the community for a long time. It was used by the jail for a little while. And we also have the warden's residence, which is where I am. It's in my office. We also have a little bit of the jail history here. So obviously Fort Saskatchewan, we still have the provincial correction facility here, but the original jail was built in 1915 and was in use until I'm forgetting now, 1987, 1988. I'm losing the date. So we have a lot of different history here. We have a reproduction of the original Northwest Mounted Police Fort, the one that would have been built in 1875. That's just off the grounds of the original, so you can go up and look and see where the original would have been, because it's right next to the reproduction. You kind of see how the Northwest Mounted Police officers would have lived at that time. And so you get guided tours here. We're not open at the moment, but we'll be opening pretty soon in September again. And so we're open year round. You can book tours through us, and they usually take around 2 hours, and you can come in and you get one of us walking around and telling you about the history of Fort Saskatchewan in the area.
And it is a very rich history. That's Kyle Bjornson, the curator from the Fort Heritage Precinct. Kyle, anything else you want to add?
No, I think that's it. Thank you for having me on.
Well, I appreciate your time and teaching us all about our history here in Fort Saskatchewan on the Heartland Tour, powered by OK Tire.